I am so excited that you chose to attend this workshop on data storytelling for data scientists. And that's because I want your first introduction and experience with data storytelling to go differently than mine. Hi, my name is Hana, and I've been working in the data field for about 8 years now. I started in academia studying and researching geography at UCLA, and then moving to work in the industry after I got my master's. As a geographer, the first data visualization I made was a map. I also did data analysis as a graduate researcher, and I realized that I really enjoy working with data. So I decided to work in the industry as a data analyst. 6 years later, I now have a passion for teaching data professionals how to become effective in visualizing and presenting data. One way I do that is through my podcast called The Art of Communicating Data, which you can find on your favorite podcast player. I am thrilled to be here today to talk to you about data storytelling. I will be in the chat today, so feel free to drop your comments and questions in the chat box. It will be great now that I've introduced myself to you if you can do the same and tell me where you're watching this from and what job role or field you're in. I would love to get to know you better. So go ahead and do that in the chat box right now. So back to data storytelling. Data storytelling is a funny term, at least when I first heard it. The first time I heard about data storytelling was when I was in graduate school. I did not specifically study in the field of data, so a lot of these terms were new to me. As I mentioned, I received my bachelor's in geography and was doing my master's in geography as well. But my research involved working with data, specifically in the Earth System Sciences specialization. At the beginning of my second year, my advisor convinced me to enter a presentation competition at a major conference just for practice. Neither of us really had any expectation of winning, so there was not that much pressure. When she suggested the idea, my research on this new project had just begun, and she was pretty confident that by the time the conference happened, I would have progressed enough to have something to show or present by then. So I said, why not? But as the date approached, I started to get really nervous because I had preliminary results, but the research was not complete. Mind you, this was not even my thesis project. This was a separate, small pet project my advisor and I had decided to do because of some current events that were happening that made it worthwhile to explore at that time. So I got a little nervous and approached my advisor for advice on what to do to prepare for this presentation. She suggested that I still present whatever preliminary results I had, but to tell a story with it. I was a bit thrown off because I didn't expect the leading advice about a research presentation at an academic conference to be tell a story. The stranger thing was that when I was an undergrad, I did work for a student magazine, so I knew about storytelling when it came to that. But for some reason, when it came to my research, when it came to data, I just assumed that people would be more swayed by numbers. If I just showed them that I spent a lot of time doing research and that I knew what I was talking about by sounding smart, maybe that would be sufficient. I thought maybe it's okay if they don't understand my research as long as I sound like I know what I'm talking about and that my results sound important. Maybe that's enough to impress them. But I took her advice seriously and I crafted a story for my audience and the judges because remember, I had entered a presentation competition. Fast forward to the conference day. Of course, other things went wrong. This was a conference where you brought a physical poster with you to present your research, so it's not a slide deck. I hadn't been to an academic conference before that, so I really had no idea what to expect. My department had a poster printing machine that I could use, but since I was flying into my hometown to attend the conference, I just figured that it's going to be a hassle trying to fly with a poster, especially, looking the way I do. I didn't want to attract extra attention to myself. So the day before my conference, I went to Costco to print out my poster because, I figured in Costco, everything comes in big sizes. So I'm sure I'm able to print a poster there. So I asked them to print my poster in the largest size they had and took that with me to the conference. Once I got there, I went into this hall where there are rows and rows of posters that you're supposed to attach your poster to. And that's when I realized that my poster was about at least half the size of most of these posters. I stood out in a bad way, and I was sure that I had no chance of winning the competition for sure now, and I was going to be a little bit embarrassed. So here's where I was at. I had incomplete research with only preliminary results and a small poster to show for it. I really didn't have much to lose at this point. Because I'm sure you're all curious, I took this picture today of that same exact poster. I still have that poster. You can even see the aged Costco receipt because this is from a long time ago, so it's yellowed a little bit. It was helpful to have this receipt because I could read the dimension. It was a 20 by 30 poster, the largest size they had at Costco. And apparently, typically the posters at conferences are at least twice the size, if not bigger. I looked it up. Usually what's considered a small poster in the university where I was a graduate student, it's a 36 by 48. So that's considered a small poster. That already is much bigger than what I brought. And the typical size used is 48 by 60. I distinctly remember my advisor's face when she saw the size of my poster, and I'm pretty sure what I saw was a look of disappointment and maybe a little embarrassment. But anyways, when it came time to present, all the contestants were taken to a separate room where we laid out our poster there, and my audience huddled around my tiny poster, and I decided I'm going to lean into my data story and confidently present what I have to show for my work. I made sure that my voice projected well, and I told my story in an animated way to get my audience excited. A couple of weeks after the presentation, I got an email from the judges that I won the presentation competition, and they particularly appreciated the delivery of my work and the story I told that day. That's when I learned how important data storytelling can be. Remember that we are data storytellers. By we, I don't mean just data professionals. I mean humans. We love stories, and we often use stories to convey warnings, lessons, morals, and messages that we want to be remembered. We use stories to also break down complex subjects into something simpler that our audience can understand. When it comes to data, we can use stories to pass along important insights, recommendations, and ideas from our work to our audience members in a way that's actionable and memorable for them. Let's talk about what data storytelling is not. It's not just showing charts. It's not making up fictitious stories or data, and it's not about sharing anecdotes. I want to emphasize that data stories need to have a strong data foundation. Otherwise, your credibility is at risk. So do your due diligence. Data storytelling is also not about bombarding our audience with a lot of facts or information. A lot of us make the mistake, like I did, of assuming that our objective when sharing our work is to deliver information. Maybe we think it will impress our audience and give us credibility. This may be the case if you plan on presenting your work to fellow data scientists, but for the most part, you'll be sharing your work with other people. Your non-data scientists or non-technical audience members won't care about how you coded your model or how you resolved a tricky bug in your code. But you may be wondering, why is this necessary for data scientists, especially if the people you work for value your work and understand how important your work is for their business or organization? Isn't building a successful model enough? In his book, Managing Your Data Science Projects, Robert DeGraff says, the reality is that to be allowed to build and then implement a model, you will most likely have needed to sell yourself, your idea for a model, and then your actual model to people at different stage gates along the way. So you will need to persuade and convince different people at each of these gates about your work. And you also will need to connect the dots for them on how valuable your work is to them. It's your job as a data scientist to do this for your audience. So make sure you connect the dots for them and show them how your work is going to make their life easier. And one way you can do that is with a story, telling a data story that helps your audience see the value of your work and how it can help them. So here are some reasons why we should use stories. We can use stories to try to get the attention of our audience. We can use it to explain something complex so that they can understand the message. And we can use it to get them to do something, some action. And we can use stories to help make our message memorable. In order to create an effective data story that will resonate with your audience, you need to actually know your audience. But before I talk about that, I want to emphasize something that I noticed some data professionals overlook to do, and that is identify who your target audience is in the first place. Now, there are likely going to be other people who are exposed to your data story. This may include your peers, your boss, or other members of your team or outside of them, but they are not all necessarily your target audience. Before crafting your data story, you should identify who your target audience is so that you can focus on them and not dilute your message when trying to cater to everyone. Your target audience members are usually the key decision makers or stakeholders, so focus on them, because if you try to prepare your data story for everyone, you may risk losing the attention of your target audience. So now that we have that clarified, I'm going to go over what you need to know about your audience that can help you with creating your data story. So now that you know who your target audience is, try to answer these questions about them. What motivates them? What are their concerns? And maybe what keeps them up at night? If you work in the industry, these questions will help you identify their business concerns, problems, and needs that your audience members have. Also think about why would and should they be interested in this topic. So try to connect your topic to what motivates them or concerns them. Also think about what questions do they ask about this topic. So this could be something you include in your story, answering those questions. These are just some examples of questions you can ask. You can definitely ask more questions about your audience. And if you can't answer them all on your own, you can reach out to them directly or ask someone who knows them to get some answers. I've prepared a worksheet for you to fill out that will help you identify your target audience and get to know them in a way that will help you craft your data story. Take the next few minutes to go through this worksheet to fill out for an upcoming report or presentation or data viz that you need to make that could benefit from having a data story. You can also use a past project to complete this, and if you are still a student, you can use a class or research project for this exercise as well. This first part of the worksheet will cover how to identify your target audience. If you already know who your target audience is for this exercise, then you can skip over to the next section. So to identify your target audience, we're going to be figuring out who is or will be directly impacted, either positively or negatively, by your project, and also identify who is indirectly impacted. And I want you to identify both the ones who are directly and indirectly impacted, because the former group, the ones who are directly impacted, they will have more influence and say in your project than the latter group. It's important for you to distinguish between them so you can really hone in on your target. Another question you can ask is, who has the decision-making power to approve or reject your proposal or recommendations? Finally, this last question I put in there because I know some people do not always work directly with their stakeholders. And if that's the case, the people that you're presenting your data story to aren't going to be your direct stakeholders, then you think about who from your audience has the influence over those stakeholders so that you can focus on them. The second part of the worksheet are questions to answer so that you can get to know your audience better. So these are some questions you've seen me put up on the slide right before this, which are, what motivates them, what are their concerns, etc. So I'll drop the link to the worksheet in the chat, and I'll give you 5 minutes to complete this worksheet. If you have any questions, you can feel free to pop them in the chat box and I will answer them for you. Once you know your audience, you'll need to then identify the big idea for your story. This is a term coined by Nancy Duarte. So what the big idea is, it's basically the one sentence that you want your audience to take away from your data story. That's the big idea. According to Nancy, it's made up of a few things. One, it conveys your unique perspective as a data scientist. It's one complete sentence, as I've said, and it conveys what is at stake. So the big idea is important in addressing the so what, why should I care question that your audience will have when hearing your data story. Here's an example of a big idea for data scientists. If we don't do the action that you want them to take or your recommendation, for instance, adopt this model, we will see, and you list the major costs to the business. Do you see why the first thing we did was to get to know our audience? Because imagine if we had used this example when sharing our work to team members who are made up of fellow data professionals. They will be confused because they are not the business decision makers, and their primary concerns aren't the business costs. So it's really important to identify who your target audience is so you know how to phrase this big idea. Once you know your audience and have prepared the big idea, you will now have an easier time crafting your data story. There are a variety of ways that you can narrate your data story. Typically, a story has a beginning, middle, and end. In the next few slides, I'll cover some ideas for what to include in the beginning, middle, and end. There are some elements that I strongly recommend that you include in certain parts of your data story. The rest you can move around depending on what narrative flow you decide to go with, especially based on your audience. Regardless of what narrative flow you choose, I strongly recommend starting with a hook. A hook is what captures your audience's attention so that you can reel them into your story. You've probably sat in meetings and presentations before and noticed how maybe you or other members are getting distracted easily, or maybe when you're reading a report, it's just hard for you to get into this report. So think about what you can say at the beginning to capture their attention. It will depend on your audience and what you know motivates them. Perhaps hearing about an anomaly will intrigue them, or a crazy stat related to the topic would pique their curiosity. So put some thought into what you think will work for your audience. Another example of a hook in a great data story is when it focuses on a contradiction of some kind. I read this paper from last year on data storytelling in the sciences, and here's a quote from that paper. Good stories should violate our expectations because that makes us curious. The best stories employ surprise because surprise begets questions, which beget interest, which begets personal engagement, which leads to learning. Let's be honest, few people would be intrigued by a predictable cause and effect or chain of events. If you're in the sciences, this is easy to do because you're in the field where you make new discoveries or uncover new explanations, but you can also apply this in other fields, especially if you can uncover a new strategy to explore or a new trend or an unlikely relationship. So we're still talking about what to put in the beginning of your story. And if during your project you came across a problem that your audience might find intriguing, I strongly recommend including this in your story, but without giving away the solution right away. Because if you build suspense, you will be building some discomfort for your audience around the problem, and you'll intrigue them. And they'll likely want to continue listening to your story so that they can hear how the problem got resolved. The beginning of your story is also where you may need to set up the scene for your audience, depending on their level of knowledge on this topic. So think about what context, if any, you need to provide to them, and what do they need to know to understand your story. Now on to the middle portion. This is where you can provide supporting evidence. So identify key insights that will help you support your big idea. You don't have to share everything. You don't have to share all your insights. Figure out which ones provide crucial context, which of these findings were unexpected or surprising, and what will help with supporting your big idea. Avoid information overload and remove anything that seems unnecessary. And you can do this by removing certain things and testing if your narrative still makes sense. Also, don't forget to discuss potential solutions and recommendations during this part. So, what are the potential solutions for the problem that you brought up? Which one did you end up going with? If your objective is to have your audience approve a model or a proposal or take action on a recommended solution, this is where you state your recommendations and why you think it's the best one. Sometimes that will also mean connecting your recommendations to benefits that you know motivates them. So talking about what will happen if the recommendation is taken. You also want to cover what will happen if the recommended action is not taken. This will help your target audience make an informed decision and hopefully encourage them to act soon. Now, at the end of your data story, you can do a few things. This is optional, but you can try to connect it back to the opening or how you started off your data story with the hook. That's one option. You can make it a full circle. You can also choose to use this time to summarize the main points. But the most important part is you make sure you highlight either the big idea or the takeaway that you wanted your audience to leave with, or with the action items and next steps that you want them to take. You should make it very clear here what recommendation you want your audience to take. Sometimes we assume that our audience will know exactly what needs to be done. We think it's obvious and that maybe they'll be able to read between the lines, but I don't recommend risking it. So I really recommend spelling out in the end what action that you want them to take. Now, before I end this workshop, I want to share some additional tactics when preparing your data story. So I did share a narrative flow that works for most people, but you may need to tweak the narrative flow depending on the audience that you're presenting to. What I found that for busy people, especially executives, they may not necessarily like the narrative flow that I laid out up until now. So one flow to try out is to actually lead with the ending. So that means starting with a call to action, telling the audience what they need to do, and then support it with critical and supporting evidence. So this approach is really good for busy audience members, as I mentioned, but also if you already have credibility with your audience, or if the audience just cares about getting straight to the point. So again, what will help you figure out what narrative flow works for your audience is if you know more about them. So make sure you do get to know your audience. And what will happen is there will be times where you may need to present about the same topic or project to different people at different times. And when that happens, I don't recommend just copying and pasting the same exact data story each time you present the story to a different audience members. I want you to do the exercise of getting to know this new audience and figuring out how to tweak your data story to cater it towards them. The other advice I have is that when you are crafting your data story, resist the temptation to open up a program or software first. That includes a data visualization software if it's going to be a visual data story, or a slide deck software if it's going to be a presentation. Instead, I want you to take out a paper or a whiteboard or Post-its and for you to sketch out your data story first. And the reason I recommend this is because I've noticed from my experience that these softwares will limit your brainstorming. And for me, it was also really distracting because I would focus on the details of the program, like choosing the theme or style, instead of actually getting my ideas flowing. After you're done sketching out the story, you can review the order and rearrange as needed. And I like to use Post-its for this reason because it is much easier for me to reorganize my ideas. You can just move around the Post-its so that you can make a story that makes sense for your audience. Now I want to share a framework some folks at Tableau have shared in articles and presentations, like this article by Martha Kang. This article covers 7 different types of data stories, and it's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but you can use them as a starting point when you feel stuck on what story to tell with your data. As you go through each of these types, remember to keep your target audience and your big idea in mind when deciding which type of data story to go with. The first type is showing change over time. You can focus on one variable and show how it changes over time. You can use this story to point out any trends, outliers, or inflection points that you may have discovered in your data. To make this data story actionable, you can point out to your target audience what successes or failures from the past that they can learn from, and maybe what they can do in the future. In this visualization example, I like how the time periods are shown in chunks and annotations were added to help tell the story chronologically. If you're familiar with Tableau, you'll also recognize the story feature that was used to show this change over time, rather than showing this all as one static visualization. The second type of story is starting big and then drilling down. So this means starting broad and going deeper. This is a good story to go with if you have a complex trend you want to deep dive into, or a broader context you want your audience to be aware about when making decisions about a specific factor that you drill down on. In this example, we're starting out with a map that's providing a big view, and then the audience can drill down on the region level. You can also go in the other direction by starting your focus with one particular area of the data and then zooming out to compare it with the rest of the data. If you're deciding between this strategy of starting at the micro level and zooming out versus the previous data story that we talked about of starting broad and then drilling down, I recommend trying out both narratives with yourself or some colleagues, and then see which one is more effective in getting your big idea or message across. The fourth type is highlighting contrast in the data. Maybe you want to show how things are different between different categories, like regions in this example. So this data story type works if you have data with different variables or maybe multiple similar data sets. You can make this actionable by advising what can be done to make these categories more aligned, like how to make one type of product perform as well in terms of profits like another well-performing product. Another interesting story could be found at the intersection point where one category overtakes another category. Depending on if this shift is good or bad, your audience could be motivated by the story to prevent or continue doing something to either avoid this shift in the future or bring it again. If this shift happened at a certain point in time, you can do a combination and use the first type of story that we talked about to slowly show what happens over time that leads up to this intersection point, like this example does. The sixth type of data story is dissecting the factors. This is when you have one main metric and you try to explain the various factors that could be influencing it the most, like showing correlation or causations between different factors. Using this story can help your target audience see which factors we should focus on the most, or how we can use one or more of these factors to predict or control the main metric that they care about. So this story can help your target audience prioritize different factors if you're working with a lot of them, and can help them focus their efforts in the future and also figure out which ones are not as important to focus on. One of my favorite story type is profiling the outliers, which is the last data story type we're going to look at. This is when you find a data point or few that are substantially different from the rest. If this outlier is relevant to your big idea and your target audience, you can use this story type to show what makes this different. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? And what can be done to promote or mitigate this from showing up in the future? You may want to use a combination of other data story types to explain or explore this outlier further with your audience. For instance, you can use a drill down story, like in this example, to drill down on the US, which is the clear outlier in the story, and maybe explore the number of government requests by state or show how the number of requests have changed over time. Maybe there was a spike after a certain point that corresponds to the US government's stance on social media monitoring. So I do recommend checking out this article and saving these 7 data story types as a starting point for you when you struggle with crafting your data story. Remember that there can be other data story types that you end up using, and this is just meant to be a starting point. You can use this QR code on the screen here to access this article using your mobile device, or I'll drop the link in the chat for you to also access the article that way. Finally, I do want to share some additional resources if you're interested in further learning about data storytelling, which I'm sure after today you are. A very popular book is Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. She actually wrote 2 books related to this. The first one is on the left. That's the first book published, and this covers data visualization and visual data storytelling, which is going to be a common form of data storytelling you do as a data scientist and something other data professionals do as well. She also did publish a sequel to this book, which is on the right, and it's called Storytelling with Data, Let's Practice. So it's more of a practice workbook that you can use to help you implement what you learned from her first book. So I recommend using both books if you are new to data storytelling and also someone who has to visualize data. This book was published after my first data storytelling experience that I told you about at the beginning of this workshop. I really wish this book had been around when I started with data storytelling, so I wouldn't have been so confused about how to tell a story with data and how to visualize my data in an effective way. Another book, if you want to deep dive into data storytelling further, is called Effective Data Storytelling by Brent Dykes. He goes into a lot more depth and with a lot more examples. But honestly, if you are worried about honing your data storytelling skills, just know that you will get better in data storytelling the more you practice and implement what I taught you today. My first data story was far from perfect, but as you get practice and get to know what works for your specific audience, you will get better. So it was a pleasure speaking to you all today about data storytelling. If you enjoyed this workshop, then do check out my podcast, The Art of Communicating Data. You can find it on your favorite podcasting player. I talk about different forms of data communication, but I do also focus on data storytelling. Just know that generally as a data scientist, honing your data communication skills is going to be important. So I highly recommend that you check out this podcast. I also feature some guests. And if you're interested in becoming a guest in my podcast, you can definitely reach out to me. You can also find additional resources related to presenting and visualizing data on my website by scanning this QR code. I do have a free roadmap on data presentations that you can find on my website. It's a PDF that can help you prepare for your next data presentation. Thank you all again, and I hope you benefited from this workshop. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, or you can also reach out to me directly.